Do you think the biggest myths around sleep and nutrition, the links with, people that come or ask you questions, sort of crazy stuff that people think?
Well, there was one study of a milk formula in the 1970s that took a while to be dispelled out of people's minds, which was this idea that, milk has some kind of particular properties that enhance sleep. And actually, there was an article recently in the paper about farmers that were feeding their cows kind of melatonin on top, and saying that they were producing this melatonin enriched milk, and that would enhance sleep. So no, I mean, typically, there's been some kind of myths about not necessarily isolated nutrients, but more things like, we don't need to worry about the timing of food intake, late night eating doesn't, and typically what's looked at in that sense is weight loss studies where people are eating, 500-700 calories less than they ordinarily would. So in that context of an energy deficit, maybe the timing's less relevant, but that's not representative of people at the population. So I think that for me, the biggest myth has been that timing is irrelevant for sleep quality, and that's categorically not supported by really any literature outside of the odd weight loss study.
For me, it's alcohol, because I always get clients that say, I have to have a drink, that will help me get to sleep. And actually, it's unlikely to help. In fact, it's more likely to cause real problems. We know it can affect things like dopamine, which can then be more stimulating, so it actually can, make you feel slightly more awake. It can also interfere with blood sugar. It can also interfere with the circadian rhythm of melatonin production. So although some people will feel that it helps to get them to sleep quicker, their quality of sleep is absolutely disrupted. And that, I think that comes up all the time about, I'll have a little nightcap. Probably not a good idea.
And I guess the quality of sleep if people have had a really sociable weekend and they're heading into Monday, the quality of their sleep on a Sunday night isn't going to be great, is it?
Well, and the other interesting thing is that can then set up a really bad pattern for the whole week, because lack of sleep can also interfere with the hunger hormones as well. So it can actually depress hormones that are like leptin, which are related to appetite, but actually increase your hunger. And then what you're more likely to then do is start craving on things to keep your energy up, so the sugar, the caffeine. And then, of course, that will have a knock-on effect the next day. So it can be a little bit of a vicious cycle, particularly if you've had a great party weekend.
And when you look at that research, people assume that it's dramatic sleep deprivation. It's really not. A lot of that research that looks at the effects of lack of sleep on subsequent energy intake, for example, and appetite and hunger, you're talking 5.5 hours sleep. Some people would consider that a good night's sleep. And what we see predictably the next day is a preference for very energy dense foods that are high in sugar, fat and salt. And that's often because there is a desire to have increased energy for the extended wakefulness of having a lack of sleep. And there's up to a 22% increase in people's caloric intake the following day after 5.5 hours sleep. That ties to the dysregulation in appetite and hunger hormones. So there is a knock-on effect. And the other thing that's come out of that research is we've typically associated jet lag as quite extreme. You fly to LA and you're out of kilter. But there's a term now coming out of the circadian research called social jet lag, and that's basically what it sounds like. It's people spend their Monday to Friday trying to catch up on the sleep they lost from the weekend, but then they get to Friday.
I have that the opposite way around.
You're trying to make up for the week's work on the weekend. But yeah, so social jet lag is the difference between how much sleep you would need and how much you actually get relative to not just socializing, but also work and stuff. So it is something to I think for us to generally start paying attention to is, how much do we knock ourselves out of kilter a little bit? Not necessarily in the extreme sense like flying to Australia, but actually kind of habitually in our daily, weekly lives.
Changes. So what would they be? What would your simple changes be to someone who's thinking, right, what do I need to do nutritionally? I've looked at everything else. I can't sleep. I've got the blackout blouse, the earplugs, the good bed, etc., etc. I still can't sleep.
Yeah. So going firstly back to the sort of timing. So 3 regular meals. Evening meal, try and bring it slightly earlier if they were someone that was eating it late. Make sure you've got some easy to digest protein and carbohydrates. So, you know, nothing complicated. It could just be rice with some fish and vegetables. I mean, it's nothing complicated. Not lots of spice if you get lots of heartburn. Not lots of fat if also you get heartburn or digestive problems. And, you know, if you are struggling, then maybe a glass of cherry juice an hour before you go to bed, handful of nuts, an Epsom salt bath. Those sort of simple changes can have actually quite a profound effect on quality of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Any other tips from you?
I would say, and we briefly touched on this earlier, but in the overall circadian kind of rhythm over the whole day, giving yourself distinct cycles of feeding and fasting that correspond with being awake or being asleep. So a simple thing for people is just having an eating window of around 10, maybe 11 hours. What you see at the population level in the UK is most people are spending up to 15 or 16 hours a day, you know, in a post-fed state. So, you know, if you're having breakfast at 8, having dinner at 7, but if you're not going to be able to have dinner that early, you could delay breakfast an extra hour, for example, and eat at 8. And generally, in that sense, what I'd say is have more of your energy intake early in the day. In between your breakfast and your lunch, have most of your daily energy, and dinner then relatively lighter compared to breakfast and lunch. And in terms of composition of the meal, I would agree that generally a good quality carbohydrate and protein based meal with a slightly lower fat content.
For some of my clients as well, interestingly, there's now quite a lot of research on the gut and how that can affect neurotransmitter production and your sleep patterns. And so for some of them, I will encourage them to have what we call fermented foods during the day as well. So things like yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut. Because there's now a lot of good research on making sure you've got a good microbiome diversity, which then also affect the brain, but also produce things like serotonin and so on. So if someone comes to me with some digestive problems, then I would absolutely be looking at that to help them sleep.